May 13, 1862, 3 o'clock in the morning, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. A Confederate military transport ship, the CSS Planter, eased away from the wharf. Smoke rose from its stack. The South Carolina and Confederate flags flew from its masts. Everything looked routine, but this was not routine. At the helm stood 23-year-old Robert Smalls, an enslaved man wearing the captain's hat and coat. Standing exactly as he had watched the white captain stand 100 times before. Below decks and on the main deck were 7 other enslaved crew members, and hidden in the cargo hold were 8 more people: Small's wife, Hannah, their 2 children, Elizabeth and Robert Jr., and the families of the other crew members. 16 enslaved people stealing a Confederate warship in the middle of the Civil War, in the heart of the Confederacy. Ahead of them lay 5 Confederate checkpoints. 5 chances to be discovered. 5 opportunities for Confederate soldiers to realize that the people on this ship were not white officers but escaped slaves. If they were caught, they would all be hanged. No trial, no mercy, just death. But if they succeeded, if they could pass those checkpoints and reach the Union blockade ships waiting 7 miles away at the mouth of the harbor, they would be free. Robert Smalls had been planning this for weeks. He knew the signal codes. He knew the waterways. He knew exactly how the captain stood and moved and gave orders. He had one chance, and he was taking it. This is the story of Robert Smalls, the enslaved man who stole a Confederate warship, who delivered it to the Union Navy along with weapons, ammunition, and military intelligence that would help win the war, who became a Union war hero at 23, and who would go on to serve 5 terms in the United States Congress. This is the story of one of the most daring escapes in American history. Welcome, friends. I am so glad you are here with me today. When we talk about Civil War heroes, we usually talk about generals and soldiers. We talk about Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. We talk about battles and strategies, but today we are going to talk about a different kind of hero, a man who was born into slavery, who was forced to work for the Confederate military, who saw an opportunity and took it with courage that few of us can imagine. Robert Smalls did not just escape slavery, he stole a Confederate warship. He sailed it past 5 heavily fortified checkpoints, he delivered it to the Union Navy, and he provided intelligence that helped the Union capture strategic positions around Charleston. His escape made him famous throughout the North. President Abraham Lincoln met with him. Congress awarded him prize money. Newspapers called him a hero. But more importantly, his actions helped convince Lincoln to allow black men to serve in the Union Army. Thousands of formerly enslaved men would fight for the Union because Robert Smalls proved they could be trusted, could be brave, could be leaders. Today we are going to tell his complete story, not just the dramatic escape, but what came before and what came after, because Robert Smalls' life was remarkable from beginning to end. If you love these stories of courage and determination, of people who refused to accept their circumstances and fought for freedom, I hope you will subscribe to our channel. Now, let us go back to the beginning, to Beaufort, South Carolina, where Robert Smalls was born into slavery. Background: born into bondage. Robert Smalls was born on April 5, 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina. He was born enslaved. His mother, Lydia, was enslaved by Henry McKee, a wealthy plantation owner. His father was likely a white man, possibly McKee himself, though this was never confirmed. Smalls grew up in the McKee household. Unlike many enslaved children who worked in the fields, Smalls worked as a house servant. He had relatively better conditions than field slaves, but he was still enslaved. He was still property. When Smalls was 12 years old, his mother made an unusual request. She asked McKee to send her son to Charleston to be hired out. This was risky. Charleston was a big city. Enslaved people had more opportunities to escape there, but Lydia had a reason. She wanted her son to see slavery in its worst forms. She wanted him to see field slaves, prison slaves, slaves being whipped and sold. She wanted him to understand what his relatively privileged position really meant. She wanted him to want freedom. It worked. In Charleston, Smalls was hired out for various jobs. He worked as a lamplighter, a hotel waiter, a stevedore, a rigger, a sailmaker, and he fell in love with the water. Smalls learned to sail. He learned to navigate. He studied the tides, the currents, the sandbars of Charleston Harbor. He became an expert pilot, though enslaved black men were not allowed to hold that title officially. White ship owners trusted him. They hired him to move their vessels. They relied on his knowledge of the waterways. In 1856, at the age of 17, Smalls married Hannah Jones. She was also enslaved, working as a hotel maid. With their owner's permission, they lived together. They had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Sarah, and a son, Robert Jr., who would die as a toddler. Smalls tried to buy his family's freedom. He saved money from his wages. But Hannah's owner demanded $800 in 1862 dollars. That would be nearly $25,000 today. It would take Smalls years to save that much, and there was no guarantee that the owner would actually sell. Enslaved families could be separated at any time, sold, broken apart. Robert Smalls knew that as long as he and his family were enslaved, they had no future, they had no security. They had no freedom, he would have to find another way. The planter, a chance appears. In April of 1861, the Civil War began with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Smalls watched the first shots of the war from the Charleston waterfront. The Confederacy seized control of Charleston. The harbor became a military zone. Confederate forces built fortifications. They armed the forts. They prepared for a long war, and they needed ships to move supplies, ammunition, and troops around the harbor. One of those ships was the CSS Planter. The Planter was a side-wheel steamship. Originally a cotton transport, it had been converted into an armed military transport. It carried a 32-pound pivot gun, a 24-pound howitzer, and the gun that had been damaged in the attack on Fort Sumter. It was armed with 200 rounds of ammunition. The Planter's job was to ferry supplies, troops, and ammunition between the forts around Charleston Harbor. It was also used to lay mines in the harbor approaches. The Confederate military hired Robert Smalls to pilot the Planter. His knowledge of the harbor was invaluable. He knew every channel, every sandbar, every current. The Planter had 3 white officers, Captain Charles Relea, first mate, and an engineer, and it had 8 enslaved crew members, including Smalls. The white officers trusted Smalls. They had no choice. They needed his navigational skills. And like many white Southerners, they simply could not imagine that enslaved men would be capable of stealing a Confederate warship. That assumption would cost them dearly. As Smalls piloted the Planter day after day, he learned something crucial. The white officers did not stay on the ship at night. They went ashore to sleep in their own homes. They left the enslaved crew members alone on the ship, unguarded overnight. This was a violation of basic security, but it was common practice. The Confederates simply did not believe enslaved men would dare to steal a ship. Robert Smalls saw an opportunity, and he started to plan. The plan, be free or die. Sometime in early May of 1862, Smalls shared his plan with the other enslaved crew members. Well, most of them. There was one man he did not trust. That man was not told. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. They would wait for a night when the white officers went ashore. They would fire up the boilers. They would pick up their families from a prearranged location. And they would sail the Planter past the Confederate forts and out to the Union blockade ships. The risks were enormous. If they were discovered at any checkpoint, they would be shot on sight or captured and hanged. Every man, woman, and child aboard would die. When Smalls told his wife Hannah about the plan, she understood the danger. But she also understood that they had no future in slavery. According to historian Kate Lineberry, Hannah said, "It is a risk, dear, but you and I and our little ones must be free. I will go, for where you die, I will die." The crew was terrified. 2 of them ultimately did not join the escape, but the others decided that freedom was worth the risk. Smalls studied everything he needed to know: the signal codes for passing the forts, the exact whistle signals the Planter used, the way Captain Relea stood and moved. Smalls even practiced wearing the captain's distinctive straw hat and coat, mimicking his posture and mannerisms. The other crew members laughed at his imitation. One said Smalls looked just like the captain. That observation would save their lives. On the evening of May 12, 1862, the Planter picked up 4 large artillery pieces at Coles Island, a Confederate post on the Stono River. They loaded 200 pounds of ammunition. They loaded 20 cords of firewood. The ship docked at the wharf below General Roswell Ripley's headquarters in Charleston. Captain Relea and the other 2 white officers went ashore for the night. This was it, the moment Smalls had been planning for. He gathered the crew. They sent messages to their families to be ready, and they waited for the early morning hours when darkness would give them the best chance. At 3 a.m. on May 13, 1862, Robert Smalls gave the order, "Fire up the boilers, we're leaving." The escape past 5 forts. Smalls put on Captain Relea's straw hat and his long coat. He stood at the helm exactly as he had watched Relea stand, arms folded, posture confident. The crew raised the Confederate and South Carolina flags. At 3:15 a.m., the Planter eased away from the wharf. The first stop was a nearby wharf where the families were waiting, Hannah and the children, the other crew members' wives and children. They boarded quickly and hid below deck. 16 people total. 8 crew members and 8 family members, all betting their lives on Robert Small's plan. Now came the dangerous part: 5 Confederate checkpoints between them and the open ocean. The first 4 went smoothly. Smalls gave the correct signal whistles. He maintained the proper speed. He stood at the helm looking like the captain. In the darkness, the Confederate guards saw what they expected to see: a routine supply run. But the 5th checkpoint was Fort Sumter, the most heavily fortified position in Charleston Harbor, the place where the Civil War had begun. As the Planter approached Fort Sumter at 4:15 a.m., Smalls had to steer close to the watchtower, close enough for the guards to see the ship clearly. He maintained his posture, arms folded, captain's hat at the distinctive angle. The ship gave the correct signal whistles. The Confederate guards at Fort Sumter waved them through. They had passed the last checkpoint, but they were not safe yet. They were still in range of Confederate guns. If anyone realized what was happening, the forts could fire on them. Smalls waited until they were out of range. Then he ordered the Confederate and South Carolina flags lowered. In their place, the crew raised a white bedsheet. The Planter accelerated toward the Union blockade ships. The surrender. Good morning, sir. The USS Onward, a Union blockade ship, spotted the approaching vessel. At first, they prepared to fire. It looked like a Confederate ship trying to run the blockade or launch an attack. Then they saw the white flag. The Onward's crew hesitated. Was this a trick? Confederate ships sometimes used false flags. As the Planter drew closer, the Union sailors saw something that shocked them. The deck was crowded with black people. Men, women, children, no white officers visible. The Planter pulled alongside the Onward. Robert Smalls stepped forward. He removed the captain's hat, and he called out, "Good morning, sir. I've brought you some of the old United States guns, sir." The Union captain could barely believe what he was seeing. An enslaved crew had stolen a Confederate warship. They had brought weapons, ammunition, and military intelligence. Smalls came aboard the Onward. He handed over the codebook containing all the Confederate signal codes. He handed over maps showing where the Confederates had laid mines in Charleston Harbor. He described the defensive positions in detail, and he formally surrendered the Planter to the United States Navy. After sailing for over 2 hours, passing 5 Confederate checkpoints, Robert Smalls and 15 other enslaved people were free. News of Robert Smalls' escape spread quickly. In the North, newspapers celebrated him as a hero, the slave who stole a Confederate warship, the brave pilot. Congress passed a bill awarding Smalls and his crew prize money for capturing the Planter. Smalls received $1,500, a fortune for a formerly enslaved man. In the South, there was fury and embarrassment. How had enslaved men stolen a Confederate warship? How had they passed 5 checkpoints? Southern newspapers demanded that the officers who had left the ship unguarded be court-martialed. But the damage was done. The Confederacy had lost a valuable ship. They had lost weapons and ammunition. They had lost their signal codes and mine maps. They had lost face. More importantly, Robert Smalls' actions had strategic consequences. 1 week after his escape, using the intelligence Smalls provided, Union forces captured Coles Island and established a base there. The Stono Inlet became a Union-controlled position for the rest of the war, and Smalls' example helped change the course of the war in another way. In July of 1862, Robert Smalls traveled to Washington, D.C. He met with President Abraham Lincoln. He told Lincoln about his escape. He told Lincoln about the thousands of enslaved men in the South who wanted to fight for the Union. Lincoln was impressed. And shortly after meeting with Smalls, Lincoln authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. By the end of the war, over 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army and Navy. Many of them were formerly enslaved. Many of them cited Robert Smalls as their inspiration. One man's courage had opened the door for thousands. The war, Captain Smalls. Robert Smalls did not just escape and retire. He became a Union war hero who continued to serve. The Planter was commissioned into the United States Navy, and Robert Smalls continued to pilot it. He knew Charleston Harbor better than any Union officer. He guided Union ships through the channels he had navigated for years. In April of 1863, Smalls was piloting the USS Keokuk, an ironclad, during an attack on Charleston. The Keokuk was hit over 90 times by Confederate artillery. It was badly damaged and later sank. Smalls was injured but survived. In 1864, Robert Smalls was promoted to captain of the Planter. He was the first black man to command a United States Navy vessel. Think about that. A man who had been enslaved just 2 years earlier was now a captain in the United States Navy. Smalls commanded the Planter for the rest of the war. He fought in 17 engagements. He was never defeated, he was never captured, and in 1864, using his prize money from the Planter, Smalls purchased the McKee Mansion in Beaufort, the house where he had been enslaved as a child, the house where his mother had worked as a slave. He bought it, and he moved his family in. The formerly enslaved man was now the master of the house. After the war. After the war ended in 1865, Robert Smalls returned to Beaufort. He was a hero, a war veteran, a property owner, and he decided to enter politics. During Reconstruction, when black men could vote and hold office, Smalls was elected to the South Carolina State Legislature. Then in 1874, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. Congressman Robert Smalls, from slave to ship captain to United States Congressman, in less than 15 years. Smalls served 5 terms in Congress. He fought for civil rights, he fought for education, he fought for the rights of formerly enslaved people, he tried to add anti-discrimination amendments to Army bills. He fought against efforts to remove federal troops from the South, warning that without military protection, black citizens would be terrorized by white supremacist groups. He was right. When Reconstruction ended and federal troops withdrew, the South implemented black codes and Jim Crow laws that recreated slavery in all but name. But during his time in Congress, during that brief moment when black Americans had political power in the South, Robert Smalls fought for justice. He told the South Carolina legislature, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." Robert Smalls died on February 23, 1915 in Beaufort, South Carolina. He was 75 years old. He had lived long enough to see slavery abolished, to see black men vote and hold office, and to see those rights taken away again. But he never stopped fighting. He never stopped believing in freedom. He never stopped being the man who had stolen a Confederate warship and sailed it to freedom. Legacy. Friends, Robert Smalls' story is not just about one dramatic escape. It is about what one person can do when they refuse to accept their circumstances. Smalls could have waited. He could have hoped someone would buy his family's freedom. He could have endured slavery and prayed for the war to end. Instead, he saw an opportunity and took it. He risked everything, and he succeeded. His success freed 16 people, but it also influenced thousands. His example helped convince Lincoln to allow black soldiers. Those soldiers helped win the war. That victory freed 4 million enslaved people. One man's courage changed the course of history. Today there is a statue of Robert Smalls in Beaufort outside the Tabernacle Baptist Church. There are schools named after him. There are books about him. There is even a U.S. Army vessel named the USAV Robert Smalls. But the best memorial to Robert Smalls is the story itself. The story that should be told in every American history class. The story of the slave who stole a Confederate warship and changed the world. As we close today, I want you to picture that moment one more time. 3 a.m. May 13, 1862, Robert Smalls standing at the helm of the Planter, wearing the captain's hat, looking exactly like a Confederate officer, below deck his wife and children. The other crew members' families, 16 people betting their lives on this one moment. Ahead, 5 Confederate checkpoints, 5 chances to be discovered, 5 opportunities for everything to go wrong. And Robert Smalls, 23 years old, steering through the darkness, giving the correct signals, maintaining the pose, never wavering. He succeeded because he was brave, but also because he was smart, because he had studied, because he had planned, because he understood that freedom required not just courage but competence. Robert Smalls did not just escape slavery. He proved that enslaved people were capable of anything, capable of leadership, capable of military service, capable of governing. His life was a refutation of every lie slavery was built on. From slave to ship thief to war hero to congressman, that is not a story, that is a revolution in one man's lifetime. Friends, if this story inspired you, please share it. Robert Smalls deserves to be remembered as one of the great American heroes. And tell me in the comments, had you heard of Robert Smalls before? What part of his story amazed you most? I read every comment and I love learning from you. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, keep their memory alive.